Bonjour et bienvenue to the Alliance Française of Chicago. My name is Renee Saito. I'm director of the Mediathèque, and I'm proud to be part of an organization that has been the place for all things French for over 125 years. So what does that mean? It means, yes, we're 125 years old, which is amazing. And tonight we're so proud and happy to have the great pleasure of welcoming Gioia Diliberto, who wrote Coco at the Ritz. And please note that Gioia will sign your book after the program, where we will also enjoy a glass of rosé. And more about all of everything in a second, but first a few program notes. Not to be missed, tomorrow at 6:30 is Personal Shopper, a screening of a film by French director Olivier Assayas. Kristen Stewart is in the title role, and it's part of our Chic and You film series. Next week, we launch our plein air concert series on June 21st at 6:30 p.m. It's going to be a soirée de magique et belle musique in the courtyard with live music by Greta Pope and familiar songs and that you know and love from American and European songbooks. And remember, the Learning Center, the classes are going to start on the 27th. That's Monday the 27th. And of course, everyone's always welcome to stop by the library. We're happy to see you. There's lots going on, and it's just a nice place to hang out. So now, a little bit more about Rita Dragonette, who will be in conversation with Gioia. Both writers have authored books about women during wartime and the choices of conscience that they make. Rita is a writer who, after a career telling stories of others as a public relations executive, has returned to her original creative path. The 14th of September, her award-winning debut novel is based upon personal experience on campus during the Vietnam War. She's currently at work on a second novel, in homage to The Sun Also Rises, about expats chasing their last dream in San Miguel de Allende. She lives and writes in Chicago, where she hosts literary salons to showcase authors and their new books to avid readers. And now to you, Rita.
Merci, Renee. Well, before we get started with anything, I just want to tell you that I'm unusually excited about doing this because Gioia and I actually have known about each other for a very long time. She lived in Chicago for 30 years. We know a lot of the same people, but we had never been able to meet. So this is amazing. I had to wait for her to move to Connecticut in order to meet. And then I think it is I was going to say a kick, but you really can't do that when you're talking about war. I just think it's interesting that we both are interested in figures that do have to face dilemmas as women during war, when we always think that's more male, and what are the things that we have to do, because the choices that they face are often as heavy as the people on the front lines. And as we'll find in Coco and the Ritz, whether ill-fated or not, those choices have huge consequences. So it's a double treat for me. It's party time. Thank you very much. Now, rather than, I'm assuming that most of you saw the bio of Gioia in the invite, but so I won't go on, like too much about me. But I would like to underscore the fact that she is much lauded as a writer, incredibly prolific. Coco at the Ritz is your 7th book.
Yes.
Yes, and which for somebody struggling with her second, that's really pretty amazing. So, and she writes everything. She writes nonfiction, fiction, journalism, and even writes for others. And this is just a sidebar, personal sidebar on this, which is just another kick about being here with her. Years ago, well, not that long ago, several years ago, I told my friend Jill Wine-Banks, the Watergate prosecutor who was on MSNBC as a commentator, I just said, you are way too busy to finish your book by yourself. You need a ghostwriter. And as we're putting this together, we're talking, and guess who was her ghostwriter? I mean, do you believe that? Kel Surprise. So anyway, everything is very funny. She also, if I'm not mistaken, you wrote that book while you were writing this book?
Well,
or another
I
book.
put Coco at the Ritz aside while I was writing The Watergate Girl.
But still, you were kind of doing 24/7. So I am in awe of you as a writer and how to do all of those things. Now, to le livre of the moment. Most of the people, I think, here have probably not read the book. Some people have, so this is a brand new thing. So why don't we start with an overview of what the story is about to sort of set the scene.
The story's inspired by Coco Chanel's arrest and interrogation at the end of World War II, owing to her relationship with a Nazi spy. And I have been obsessed with this story for a long time. Coco at the Ritz is actually my second novel about Coco Chanel. 15 years ago, I wrote a novel that was set in her Paris atelier in 1919 after the First World War, when she was just revolutionizing fashion. And I was fascinated by her triumph in overcoming a really grim childhood and wedging herself into the world of wealth and celebrity and artistic achievement in Paris. She was part of the modernist movement that Picasso was involved in, and Stravinsky and Hemingway. They were overturning the old order in their arts, and she was doing the same thing in fashion. And she, of course, was close to Stravinsky. She had an affair with him. She would have liked to have had an affair with Picasso, but Chanel was exactly the kind of strong woman that Picasso avoided like the plague. And she was also very close to Jean Cocteau. So it was just this really rich territory to explore, and absolutely nothing was known about it because there were no records, and she never talked about it, and she paid people to keep her out of their memoirs. So the only way to explore it was fictionally. So I decided to write it. Well, I first actually wrote it as a play, and then I turned it into a novel.
Exciting. Doesn't that just drip? So I'm not going to ask you then what more drew you to the story, the woman or this mysterious historical thing that's undocumented. It's pretty much the same,
Well,
equal, right?
It started out with being fascinated by her. It started out for actually aesthetic reasons. I was interested in her aesthetic and how that fit into modernism. And also, I'm just a hopeless Francophile, which is, one reason why I'm completely thrilled to be here with other hopeless Francophiles and even some real French people. And a lot of my books actually are set in France. Most of them, I think, are. But I started out being interested in her as a designer, as a creator, as a visionary. And then when I learned about how she behaved during the war and realized that this legacy had been so terribly tarnished, I wondered how it had happened, what her motivations were, and what the consequences were to herself and to those around her. And actually, the consequences were pretty serious.
But we're not going to tell you because you haven't read the book yet. I think it's pretty clear that the question, certainly one of the big questions, if not the only big question of the book, without giving it away, because you learn this just immediately, is did she collaborate or not? And I think it's very clever the way that you organize the book, because you pretty much say that the answer to that, if there is an answer to that question or that dilemma, has to do with her personality and her amazingly contradictory behavior. And you sort of set that up as evidence for what is happening to this climax at the very end. So I'd like to start out talking about her personality. And I think that everyone here would agree that if you look at a book that has a name on the cover, Coco at the Ritz, you assume that that character is going to be somebody that you are to like and, or at least empathize with. But in Coco, we have a less than lovable character, and she's many things. She's prickly, she's self-absorbed, she's selfish, she shoots morphine, she sleeps with Germans, she eats steak and drinks champagne when nobody has anything else to do, anything else to eat. She does all of these things, and still, you're with her. And she kind of comes across at times as if She's just, the whole war is just something that's irritating to her because it's disturbing her convenience, and that she's outraged that anybody would question her behavior, even sleeping with Germans, because of who she is. She's an icon. So talk about that, and also talk about how it is to write a character that isn't all, you know, sunshine and lollipops for as long as it takes to write a novel, that you'd have to stay with that personality.
It's hard to write a person who's not sympathetic. Very hard. And I wrote it as a play, as I mentioned first, I think, because I didn't have to be in her head. I didn't want to be in her head because she was so awful. And I resisted that. I resisted really sort of going there for a long time. But in writing a novel in which she's the protagonist, and it's the close third person, so it's not like I wrote it in the first person. I couldn't have done that because I would have had to have been too much with her. So I had some distance. But to make an unsympathetic heroine or protagonist work, you have to really try to explore why they behaved the way they did and what the significance of it was, and where the motivations came from for their awful behavior. And so I tried to find the places where I could explain her, and to myself first, and then to the reader. She is vulnerable. Coco Chanel was above all an opportunist, and she did some really terrible things. Actually, I think sleeping with the German was probably the least wicked thing she did. It was probably more weakness than wickedness that drew her into his arms. She did a lot worse things than that during the war, which I explore in the novel. So I tried to explain her and show her vulnerability and her fear also. And in that way, not make her sympathetic, but at least make the reader interested enough to stay with her. And I think there are probably some readers who don't like that. You know, they don't like the fact that it's not black and white, that my portrayal of her doesn't come down clearly on one side or the other. But one of the things that I wanted to explore in the novel was the ambiguities of wartime morality and the ambiguities of Coco's character. As you know, most people have a lot of ambiguities and contradictions in their character, and that made her, to me, as a subject to write about, more interesting. And I think I hope it's accurate to a certain extent. My first rule in writing historical fiction is to not contradict the known truth. So I only invent in the interstitials. And as I said before, I had such latitude because so little is known about this period in her life.
Okay, well, in speaking of those contradictions, I just to tease you, to say on top of the fact that she's a little intolerable, her behavior really is it's really hard to get a handle on her. Really hard to get a handle on her. Just as examples of things, without giving too much away. So through sheer force of will, she virtually created the fashion industry and put Paris at the center of it. And yet she refused to call herself a feminist. Right? She tells us she's deeply patriotic, she's fighting for French culture, yet she lives with Germans, doesn't support the Renaissance, and even throws a radio from one of the Renaissance fighters into the sea.
The resistance fighters.
What did I say?
Renaissance.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I think she liked the Renaissance.
Oh, I was gilding her way too much. Did I say Renaissance more than that? Oh, dear, dear.
It's okay.
Okay, she's blatantly anti-Semitic, yet she has Jewish friends. She cares for those friends, yet hesitates to sign a petition to save one's life. She's highly self-absorbed, yet loves her nephew, who has been imprisoned by the Nazis and will do anything, maybe, to save him. And as another example, she's treated and assumed to be a collaborator by the Germans, yet when she's forced into her first assignment, she bungles it, possibly on purpose. The whole idea about that is it just keeps you as a reader on the edge because you keep thinking, oh my goodness, you're doing this, you're going to get caught, you're going to get this, and then she does something worse, and then she does something worse. So it's a very compelling way to unfold the personality, the character prickiness of her and the outrageous behavior. So contradictions.
Well, one big contradiction is that she well, one of the worst things she did, I'll start by saying that, is she went to the Gestapo and denounced her Jewish partner, Pierre Wertheimer, whose grandson still owns Chanel, and they're worth bazillions of dollars. She tried to use the fact that they were Jewish and that they had fled to the United States to get full control of her company. When she and her nose invented Chanel No. 5 in 1921, she had no idea that it was going to explode and become the most successful perfume on the planet, which it still is. Every 30 seconds, someone buys a bottle of Chanel No. 5. So she cared about the fashion, and she was happy to let Pierre Wertheimer, who owned this perfume company, to have 80% of the profits, and another investor had 10%. And it was because of Pierre Wertheimer's business brilliance and his distribution network, and that the perfume became as successful as it was. But once it did become so successful, this international global hit, she wanted more and more and more and more, and she kept suing them. And nothing ever came of the lawsuits, but she saw the Nazi race laws as an opportunity to get full control. And when that didn't work, because they had outsmarted her, they arranged to have their shares in the perfume company transferred to an Aryan businessman who was making planes and boats for the Germans. He kept the shares for them during the war, and the quid pro quo was he would give them back if the Allies won, and the Wertheimers would vouch for him. So you can see a great ambiguity there. First of all, you have the Jewish Wertheimers collaborating with the collaborator. So nobody comes out smelling like Chanel No. 5 here. But then Chanel, because she was unsuccessful at that, she stopped wearing Chanel No. 5. And of course, it was Chanel No. 5 that was making her filthy rich. It was Chanel No. 5, still is the cash cow for this company. And she just was bad-mouthing it, saying it wasn't any good. They were making it in America, which they were doing. They were producing it in Hoboken, New Jersey, and they were selling it in PXs and in drugstores. And she was saying it's an inferior product. And then she started making rival perfumes herself, like Chanel No. 19, Chanel No. 32, Chanel No. whatever. Some of them still exist. And that was really self-destructive, because that was not only in violation of her contract, but it was in direct competition to what was making her really rich. So she had this self-destructive, in addition to all the other contradictions in her character, she had this self-destructive streak.
And sort of this entitlement, right? I am Chanel. I have done this. I can do that.
Right. And I think part of that, if you read the book, you'll see this harebrained scheme that she got involved in. The outline of it is known. There are some documents that were released in 2011 that show that this really happened. She went to Madrid to talk to the ambassador to try and get a meeting with Winston Churchill, who was actually a friend of hers. And she was going to talk to Winston about brokering a peace and talking to Hitler, because Winston Churchill had said he wouldn't talk to Hitler, but Chanel, of course, was going to convince him to talk to Hitler. So that's...
She was Chanel.
She was, right. And she was going to go down in history as the woman who saved mankind and who ended a world war. So that was definitely her arrogance and her desire to be known for something more than just fashion.
Arrogance is powerful. There are so many people that you try not to point to it, but it's like, well, it is responsible for your success. But it certainly, she didn't seem to have anything that she was cowed about.
Well, she was very vulnerable, I think. I think she felt she had the most horrible childhood. Her mother died when she was 12. They were very poor. She never saw her father again. He stuck her in a convent orphanage with her sisters, and she was basically unloved. And she grew up feeling deprived in every way, emotionally and materially. And nothing was ever enough. She could never fill that void, that emptiness in her. It was just nothing. No amount of money was enough. No amount of men were enough. No amount of fame was enough. She wanted more and more and more and more.
And then we come to this missing gap in history. So we've heard all about Chanel, and we don't really understand her. I don't think anyone's going to ever understand Chanel. But all of this is out there. Her personality, her contradictions, her background, it's all sort of evidence, but it's hard to get a handle on her because she's doing all these different things. And then we come to the climax, which is this scene about this undocumented moment in history, of which I think you only knew 3 things. And I want to step back here and just have a writer question. You're a researcher. All of your books are either nonfiction or biography based. They're solid research. That's what brings them all to life and everything. So how do you, being used to work that way, come to leap into a scene where you just have 3 facts to start from?
Well, that was hard to write. Rita is referring to it's like the last 50 pages of the book, which is her interrogation. So we know that she was taken from the Ritz by 2 young members of the French Forces of the Interior, which was this loose band of soldiers and private citizens who'd taken up arms in the wake of the liberation of Paris, and just adolescents with guns, and they were going around France and arresting women who had slept with Germans and shaving their heads. You've probably seen these terrible pictures. And sometimes the women would get beaten up and thrown in jail, and get paraded naked through the streets. It was this really ugly episode. And these guys went to the Ritz and took Chanel, hauled her away, and brought her somewhere, nobody knows where. But we know that she was taken away. We know that she was gone for 2 hours, and we know that afterwards she left and went to Switzerland, where she lived in exile until 1954. So I made all of that up. I made up the entire interrogation because nothing was known. So I based it. I made it up. I had to make up.
It's fiction. You can do that.
It's fiction, right? I had no choice. It's based on what we know about what those kinds of interrogations would have been, and what was reasonable to expect that they would have known about her. They would have known about Spatz. And no one knows why she was released either. Why other women, there was a famous actress of the era named Arletty. I don't know if anybody has heard of Arletty. She was, really, really a big deal. And she had lived with a German officer during the war, and she was imprisoned. And I'm not sure how long she was in prison, but so, it wasn't as if they weren't punishing famous people, but Chanel got away with it. So I had to invent this scenario, which, you can tell me if you think it's plausible.
Well, and can I say a few things about it without giving it away? What I think is all of these things we've learned about her personality and how she behaves and everything, you weave this through. It's sort of a trial.
It is.
They put her on trial, and the evidence comes from all of these bizarre points of view and behavior and personality, and you're rooting for her, and you just weave that in very well to sort of bring in, and that's kind of to wrap up what I was saying before, is that you get a really good handle on Chanel and all her warts and all her good things by the time you get here. You're worried about her by the time you get there, but when you see that scene, I really loved her in that scene. And I didn't love her in the rest of the book. So it's interesting. It's very interesting about how you were able to do that and make that, one of actually the most realistic scenes in the book.
Thank you.
You're a fiction writer.
Wow.
Congratulations.
For that scene, I was anyway.
So can we talk about the upshot? Because you've already mentioned a few things before that you don't think that you would be girlfriends with Chanel. How do you come down on it? Do you feel, we have all these things that happen. Is she a heroine or a collaborator? Is she somebody who's making decisions of conscience or convenience? Is she, does she care or does she not care? All of these different kinds of things, are we to, and you just feel like at the end, not at the end, you feel like throughout parts of this, like I said, you can't get a handle on her. Is she good? Is she bad? Is she somebody who should be admired, somebody who should be vilified? I would maintain that in war, people go both ways at the same time for survival and in many different things. But it's, you just come down on that. So You mentioned, by the way, and I don't want to give too much away, and if it does, don't answer this question, but in the author's note, and by the way, you all have to read the author's note. It is, I know a lot of people don't read that after they finished it. This is the best I have ever read, and all of the hanging stuff has comments on it, but you call her the anti-Marianne.
Right. Well, I do call her the anti-Marianne because I think she, in a way, stands for the treachery of France during the war. All of France was guilty. The Vichy government was guilty. The French people who collaborated were guilty. The country collaborated, which raises the question of if the entire country collaborated, if the government collaborated, then why are you prosecuting individual people? But I think she's a symbol of that collaboration and that betrayal. And so to me, she is a kind of anti-Marianne. But I make a distinction between Chanel, the historical figure, and Chanel, the brand. And I get asked all the time if I think Chanel ought to be canceled and where she fits into today's cancel culture, because so many previously revered figures are being reassessed in terms of their private behavior, what we know now, their private behavior. And I don't think Chanel ought to be canceled, and you don't have to leave if you have a Chanel lipstick in your purse. I think it's a different. I think that she should be given credit for her accomplishments, but I think also you have to acknowledge the terrible things that she did and how that tarnishes her legacy. Something which my one complaint about the Chanel brand is that they have not dealt with it. If you go to the Chanel website, there's a timeline of her life, and there's nothing about how what she
really?
did during the war. It's like this big fat blank. And in all of the Chanel promotional films that are done with Hollywood production values and star Keira Knightley and Nicole Kidman and lots of big Hollywood stars, there's only one mention of Spatz and the war and Chanel's behavior and all of the myriad short
Spatz
films.
is the soldier that
Oh
she
yeah,
was
Spatz
living
is
with.
her Nazi boyfriend, Hans Günther von Dincklage, who was known as Spatz, which really sounds like a Nazi. But there's
she kept saying he wasn't.
She kept saying he didn't wear a uniform, and he spoke French, and he'd lived in France his entire adult life. And in fact, he was part of the Abwehr, which wasn't the SS, and his boss in the Abwehr was Wilhelm Canaris, who was part of the plot to assassinate Hitler and was beheaded by Hitler for his role in that plot. So, it's unclear how much Spatz himself supported Nazi ideology. It's unclear how much Chanel supported Nazi ideology. I don't think Chanel is on record making horrible anti-Semitic remarks. She stopped doing that after the war. But I personally don't think she supported Nazi ideology. I don't think she supported what happened to the Jews during World War II. And I don't know about Spatz. He was an opportunist, as she was, which is not to excuse their behavior. But that's a lot different than being, actively supporting the Nazi cause.
About that interrogation, you mentioned that she paid people to keep that incident out of things. That had to have been an awfully comprehensive effort. Not just memoirs of other people talking about it, but records. But there's nothing.
Right.
What do you?
Well, there was no there wouldn't have been a record, as I said, of the interrogation because it wasn't official. So there, if had it been official, once de Gaulle came back, he put an end to this brutal shaving of heads of women and putting them in jail without due process. So he set up official courts, and there are records of those official courts, but there's no record of what the FFI did. It was just sort of vigilante justice. And then she had a trust that was from a bank in Switzerland, and she used that to pay off people to keep her out of their memoirs. Yeah. So you read Jean Cocteau's diary. He mentions Chanel, but only we had dinner at blah blah blah. He never comments on her. Misia Serre, her best friend, whom you've all seen paintings of because she was painted by everybody, from Bonnard, Toulouse-Lautrec, Vuillard, Renoir. They're nodding their heads. They've seen lots of paintings of Misia. And Misia never talked about it. And Walter Schellenberg, who was the Nazi foreign intelligence officer, but who was anti-Hitler, but he was tried at Nuremberg. And during his trial at Nuremberg, he mentioned this harebrained scheme that Chanel was involved in, where she was going to go to Madrid to talk to Winston Churchill to broker a separate peace. But then when he wrote his memoir, after he was convicted and was put in prison, it's called Labyrinth, and it's like a doorstop. It's huge, hugely thick. And there, you go to the index, and there's no Chanel. There's no mention of Chanel in Caesar Ritz's memoir, also another doorstop. Caesar Ritz owned the Ritz Hotel. The son of Caesar Ritz, I think, wrote the book. And they owned the Ritz Hotel, where it all happened. The Ritz Hotel was a Nazi hive during World War II, but you're not going to read it in that book. And you're not going to see any mention of Chanel at all.
So she just wiped it out.
She wiped it out.
Imagine that in the time of social media.
No.
But I mean, she really eradicated a huge, huge secret, which is amazing. So question I have is, after spending so much time with her, 2 books, and particularly delving into what was probably not the most admirable part of her life, do you think you nailed her? And does the quest leave you satisfied, or is there another Coco book?
No more Coco.
You're not going to go anywhere near Coco.
I'm not going near that. I don't know if I nailed her. I mean, it's very hard to nail anybody, and I nailed a character that I made up, who was based on the real Chanel. So I hope she's alive on the page. I mean, that's what I tried to do to make her. I wanted to be true to the truth as it was known, but I also wanted to create a character who would be alive on the page. And she's my idea of Chanel. She might not be your idea of Chanel. She might not be the idea of another writer and there have been a lot of writers who have written about Chanel. For a long time, I had her voice in my head. That was why I was able to write the book. I think I heard her voice, so I could write Chanel dialogue until the cows came home. And I don't hear her voice anymore, thank God.
Well, and some of the things you were talking about are things that happen after the book, and you sort of, at the end of the book, leave it up to us to decide about Chanel.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if I was pushed against the wall and asked, how do I feel about her, I feel that she was fascinating and complex and endlessly interesting and, and evil in some ways. And another woman who wasn't so opportunistic would have met this handsome guy who was 13 years younger than she, and she was alone and she was lonely and she was never long without a man. So, she was sort of looking for somebody. But another woman would have said, it's probably not a great idea to get involved with this guy. But, Spatz, right. But she did. The anti-Semitism is really, really hard to take. It's hard to not be just appalled and horrified by that. And it was this kind of reflexive anti-Semitism that there was a line in the book at one point, it may have come out, where she talks to the interrogator in this interrogation scene, asks her, or raises the question about her anti-Semitism. And she says, so what, it's a crime to be anti-Semitic in France? You've heard of Alfred Dreyfus. And, but it was this reflexive kind of anti-Semitism. I don't want to say soft. I mean, some people refer to it as soft anti-Semitism. I don't want to say that because
oxymoron.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's like anything anti-Semitism is hard and horrible, and there's nothing soft at all about it. But it was this reflexive anti-Semitism that came from growing up, being surrounded by in the French countryside, being surrounded by Catholics, and probably hearing at the convent a lot of anti-Semitic stuff from the nuns. And so on. So I think, you know, that would really be something for me that would just, you know, I wouldn't be able to be in the same room with her. But I still feel that she's, you know, a fascinating, complicated character. And an important character, because her, you know, not only because she symbolizes France and what France did during the war, but her ideas still influence how women dress, and the company still is very important and influential.
And you also mentioned, I can't remember if it was in the book or a conversation where you said that her legacy in France didn't forgive her quickly, or maybe not completely ever, but she became so famous in America.
Right.
And that still to this day, isn't she?
Well, when she reopened her house, and what happened was she was bad-mouthing Chanel No. 5 so much that Pierre Wertheimer was really worried that it was going to start hurting perfume sales. And in fact, it may have hurt perfume sales. Also, she was producing these rival perfumes. And he was also worried that the press was going to start writing about her romance with Spatz and how she had behaved during the war, and he couldn't have that. And so he went to Switzerland and he said, you got to stop, and I'll give you whatever you want to get you to stop making these rival perfumes and to stop, you know, and to just, you know, play nice. And she said, well, I want to go back into fashion. I want to reopen my house, and I want to start doing fashion again. And I want you to pay my taxes, and I want to sleep at the Ritz every night, and I want you to pay for that too. And so he agreed to everything. And she went back to Paris after she closed her house in 1939. So she had not designed anything for 14 years. And so she reopened her house at the age of 71 in 1954 after being closed that whole time. No fashion, just the perfume and some other things in the boutique. And the first collection she did was when she introduced the boucle suit that we all think of as the iconic Chanel item of clothing. And it was panned by the French press. And because they remembered, they knew, the French knew what she had done. But in America, there was no social media, there was no internet. We didn't know what she had done. We didn't know about her personal life. And so her reopening was hailed as the great second coming of the fashion messiah. And it was America, it was us that made her the big hit the second time around.
I think that's fascinating. Okay, Coco's not in your head anymore, and I have had a 5-minute warning. I have one more question for you before we open the floor to the audience. You have written 7 books. They are all about very high-profile, interesting women. Diane von Furstenberg, Jane Addams, Hedley Hemingway, and more. Is there a theme that ties them all together with Coco? Or is there a criteria that you go through to figure out who your next subject is? And oh, by the way, who is that? You have to be working on something now.
I am, but
it's top secret.
Yeah, it's not top secret, but we don't have time. If I start, I won't shut up about it.
Not just a first and last name?
So it's 4 people, so that's, you know, it would take too long.
Oh, that's 5 whole minutes.
A group biography,
Okay.
Right. But I think all the women that I write about have one thing in common, and that is they symbolize the spirit of their time. That every era has these people who kind of step forward, and in their personality, in their accomplishments, in their flaws, in their mistakes, they symbolize the era that they're living in. And certainly that's Chanel, you know, symbolizing the Paris occupation. And, you know, for Diane von Furstenberg, it would be second wave feminism. And for Hedley Hemingway, it would be Jazz Age hopes and dreams. And for Jane Addams, it would be the progressive movement. And that's probably the last time you'll hear Jane Addams and Chanel in the same sentence.
Well, that's why the theme.
Right.
Help us, help us, help us. Okay, so will this be, I'll just ask one more without pinning you down. This will be the first time we're writing a book about more than focusing on one person. How's that?
Hard.
How's that for a headline?
Oh, good.
First time she writes a book with 4 people. Okay, she won't tell us what it is yet, but it's 4 people. It's not just one.
Women. All women.
All women?
Yeah, all
Okay,
women.
well, she hasn't strayed that far. Okay, the group. Okay, Ame, do you have a microphone? Questions? I'm looking at you, so. Okay, speak up and while she's getting it.
Project.
Was Coco Chanel a modernist in any deep sense? Did she connect with the modernist movement? Did she have anything to say about what modernism was about?
She did connect because she was close to Picasso. Well, she wasn't close to Picasso, but she designed costumes for production of Antigone that Jean Cocteau did. Picasso did the sets, and Stravinsky did the music. So she was, and her work in transforming the way women dressed, getting rid of corsets and hairpins, getting women to bob their hair. She was one of the first people who bobbed her hair, and getting skirts off the ground and simplifying everything was part of what was happening in all the arts, that kind of paring down and overturning the way things had been done in the Victorian era before World War I. So, but she didn't really talk about modernism as modernism, but she was definitely a modernist and connected to all those important modernist people in Paris anyway.
You had a question?
So much of wonderful things that have come on in discussion, but I want to know when we, the readers, draw the line. When do I think you're going to tell me something that's historically happened? Other times when you're telling the story.
Yeah, it's a problem.
Making up.
Right, it's a problem for a lot of people in historical fiction because they don't know. They have that question. So you don't know. I mean, you can Google. You know, you can go to Wikipedia and Google. You can Google things and and find out that way. But you don't really know. I mean, in my author's note, I try to lay out a little bit about what I based, what's fact and what's fiction, and I mentioned all the characters are based on real people, except for the interrogators, and so I make reference to that, but you don't really know. You just sort of have to go with the flow of reading the novel as a novel.
And one of the things, having written a historical fiction book myself, is I always say, everything that's in the book either happened or could have happened.
That's a good way of putting it.
So
Right.
it's it makes sense. It's not something that's coming
Right.
in from outer space. It's not, it's fiction because you couldn't have been in the room, but
Right.
it's not fiction because you made it up full cloth.
Right, and it doesn't contradict the known truth.
Right. Anyone else?
How does her time during the war compare to other French fashion designers?
Well, some of them stayed in business and said that they stayed in business because they wanted to give work to workers, and they worked under very draconian conditions where the amount of fabric, even the amount of thread, was regulated by the Germans. They could only produce so many outfits, and they could only use so many, just a certain kind of fabrics because so many of the fabrics had been requisitioned. There were some designers that fled and ended up in New York, like Mambochet and Schiaparelli wasn't in Paris, although her atelier stayed open for a while. And Christian Dior was in Paris working. So it was sort of a mixed bag, but couture was very, very reduced because of the Germans controlling it.
Abby?
As an author who spent 2 books with Chanel, do you feel that you went into writing the first or the second with a very specific viewpoint on her? And do you feel like you changed? Do you feel like you sympathize with her more? And is that a goal that you want your readers to feel? Do you want them to change their opinion about her based on just little tidbits? Because I have read it, and I'm curious to hear what you wanted with that.
So you read Coco at the Ritz. So, well, when I was writing the first book, I didn't really know all about how she'd behaved during the war. And when I found out, I thought, no one's written about this, including myself. No one's book has explored this, and including my own book, the collection. So I started out not thinking that it was as bad as it ended up being. No, she's not warm and fuzzy. She's not warm and fuzzy, which I think, may be a problem for some readers. But, I had to be true to the research and true to what my idea of her was. But yeah, I mean, she ended up being a lot more morally compromised than I thought at the start.
But not to be canceled.
Well, I mean, no, I don't think she should be canceled totally, because I think she's got to be, as I said, she's got to be given credit for being this visionary who did a lot of, who really changed fashion and whose ideas are still influential, and who created this fashion empire that's still important and influential. And I know there's all sorts of stuff on the end. There are people probably who want to cancel me because I even wrote about her. They think anything to do with Chanel, she just ought to be canceled. But I don't think that's, I think that's just not productive and not really, and not very smart either, because it doesn't reflect what people who say that tend to not know the whole story also. They just want to cancel everything.
Kathleen?
How was Coco started by Frenchmen, both before, I would say before, during, and after?
By the whole French, by French women. Well, she was very popular with the fashion-forward crowd, because her ideas were very avant-garde when she was first starting. So she was embraced by the fashionistas of Paris, and then during the war she was out of business. So she had her circle of right-wing friends that she hung around with, like Jean Cocteau. But she also had friends in the resistance. So her friends were sort of all over the place. They were not only right-wing people. And Jean Cocteau, in fact, was, he was the one that started the petition to save their friend Max Jacob, who was arrested. And that's a whole thing in the novel also. He's a big character in the novel.
I've got so many.
Oh, well, we'll give you a couple.
What drives you to have such an interest in, I don't want to see bad or naughty, difficult?
Well, I don't know, but I really want to get out of it. I really want. I really want
Did
to.
Coco knock you over the edge?
Well, I would really love to have somebody warm and fuzzy. Well, but I mean, complicated people aren't warm and fuzzy. I mean, anybody who's really interesting is not going to be totally warm and fuzzy. So, I mean, but the women I'm writing about now, at least they weren't Nazis. It doesn't. I mean,
It's a low bar.
Right. It doesn't get much worse. It doesn't get much worse than being a Nazi.
Eleanor Roosevelt, a nice person.
Actually, she wasn't all that nice. When you get right down, when you really learn about Eleanor Roosevelt, there was a lot of things about her that weren't so great too.
Hence your definition that if they're interesting, they have two sides.
Right.
Back here?
Gioia, I wonder if you could tell us in your research if you identified what it was that the Gaulle administration thought about these women, and if there are records that explain decisions to prosecute or not prosecute other high-profile women who allegedly.
That's really interesting, Karina. De Gaulle put an absolute stop to the head shavings and to the brutalization of the women who were being targeted because they had slept with Germans or had children by Germans, or even were just sometimes flirting with Germans. Some of those women were arrested. And he just was appalled by it and ended it. And then he instituted these courts to try the official collaborators. And almost everybody who was tried, not almost everybody, but the overwhelming majority of people who were tried in the official courts were men. People like Robert Braslovich, the newspaper writer, who was just, this virulently anti-Semitic writer who sent people to their deaths through his writing and was, disseminating this just vicious, awful, brutal anti-Semitic stuff. So the official courts really focused on the male collaborators who were doing more than the so-called horizontal collaboration. They were doing more than just sleeping with Germans. They were actually, consorting with the Nazis and working with them.
Joy, in your research, what did you learn about sort of her exile period in Switzerland? And when did she return to Paris in 1954?
Yes, yes.
So did she, and you may not know, or maybe this wasn't part of the story, this is the next book, which you're not the one writing.
Someone else will do this.
But do you think, did she ever confront herself? Was there any sort of reconciliation or acknowledgement of
Well, she was in Switzerland making these other perfumes and, raging against the Wertheimers. She never said anything about what she had done, except to say that she hadn't done anything wrong. And I have her suffering in the book because I think, well, I wanted her to suffer. She became a morphine addict, which suggests that she wasn't exactly happy and well-adjusted. And I do think that a lot of people who do evil things do suffer. They realize what they've done on some level, and they suffer. So I do show her suffering at the end, and injecting herself with morphine. And we do know that she was, in fact, a morphine addict.
I just want to say one thing because, and I hope you didn't cover that while I was running around outside the room. We had a guest here named Laurent Cotta, who was a curator at the Palais Galliera, and he was talking about the interior design of Gabrielle Chanel, like her beautiful apartment on the rue, right behind the Ritz, and also of her villa, La Villa La Posa. And he said that it was designed by a young Jewish architect, and that during the war he hid in the villa. So for me, it brings even more complexity.
That the architect hid in the villa?
Yeah.
No, the architect didn't.
I'm not sure about that.
Yes, he did not. No, that didn't happen.
Did not?
No, that didn't happen. But what did happen? Well, actually, in the novel, I have her friend Pierre Reddy, who was in the Resistance, who she was close to. I have him stashing radios in the basement, and actually, there were radios in the basement that the architect had stashed. So I made it up, but it turned out it was really true. But it was not Pierre Reverdy who had stashed them. It was the architect who had stashed them. But he wasn't there. But there were kitchen girls who were Jewish, who she didn't know that, who were using her house as an escape route. And they were being brought to Chanel's kitchen. She may not have even known about any of this, but she lived, they would have had to go through the woods to get through a path to escape to freedom or to safety. But there were a group of Jewish girls who were ostensibly going to Chanel's Villa La Posa to work in the kitchen, and then they just went out the back door and escaped. And so somebody was helping them do that, and so it could have been someone who worked for her. So maybe that's what he was thinking of.
It's complex.
I know, but it's fun to think of.
Contradictions everywhere.
It's fun to think of the architect hiding in the basement.
It was a complex time for France, as you say. Maybe we have time for one more question, and then I will invite you to do two things after the question. Monsieur?
Given the interrogation, there was no documentation of that at all. When you were writing that, you could have gone in any of a number of directions. We tempted possibly to increment to sort of innocent, more safely person, to a more villainous person. Did you put any responsibility for her reputation being in your hands, and that in itself led to her interpretation?
No, I didn't feel at all conscious of her reputation or what I might or might not do to it. I just wanted to be true to the character that I had created, who was based on the real Chanel, and what I thought, given her character and given the circumstances, how the interrogation would have gone. And I envisioned it as this battle of wits between the famously acerbic Chanel and this very stern, arrogant, in his own right, interrogator who could care less about fashion and could care less who she was. And so that was sort of the setup for it, the two battling it out, like that.
And you'll see.
Okay, mesdames et messieurs, I want to thank you for being with us first, but also let's give a big round of applause to Rita.
Thank you.
And Gioia.
Thank you.